Hi, everyone, and welcome to another week of Unpacking Organizations, where Shradha and I talk about our passion project, or our passion, org design and workforce planning, unpacking those complex things that are organizations. If only we could not work on our own. Shradha, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Rupert. How are you today? What was one great thing that happened or a big thing that happened last week in
Well,
your
a big
life?
thing. I'm not sure I'd call it a great thing. I'd call it a sad thing.
Oh,
My,
what happened?
well, it was not sad, but life moves on and time keeps on moving. And I had my last sports day. So I've got three boys, and there's a ritual of going for sports day and being parents and socializing with other parents and seeing kids run around tracks. And it's the last one. So I'm like, oh
Oh,
no. And it was 33-degree heat. So that's in Celsius, quite extreme. So people were melting. And I saw a possible future Olympian run. So there was a 13-year-old girl who broke the school record in the 800 meters by 20
wow.
seconds.
Wow.
And she's number one in the UK, and she's just incredible. And anyway, she almost lapped this person that was. I mean, the difference between first and second was quite extreme. Let me put it that way.
That's, oh
So
my
that was,
gosh, that's impressive, but bittersweet,
um,
I would say.
yeah, that was good. So, what about you? Anything interesting happened to you in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's summer in New York, and the good part about summer in New York is that there are lots and lots of people visiting and friends visiting. So we caught up with some old friends after 8 years, and then there are some friends visiting and staying with us. So it's the summer in New York, that excitement that actually comes, and I really look forward to that. It's a lot
Is
of
this your friend Shada that said, "Oh, we'll meet," and you didn't realize, and all of a sudden they showed up at your front door? Is that
Yeah,
you hadn't
exactly.
coordinated?
I thought I thought they were going to a different continent, but they actually were coming to me and staying with me. So yes, exactly that. So
If anyone wants to walk up, you can just knock on the door at Shredder's house and she'll take you in. Don't worry about that.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
the other good thing is that we have Nate joining us today. Nate, welcome.
Thank you so
Um,
much for having me.
Welcome to the show. So Nathan Lavoie, is that how I pronounce your last name?
Lavoie.
Yeah,
Lavoie. Okay, I should have asked before,
that's a
but I did
beautiful name,
not.
Lavoie. What does
Yeah.
Lavoie mean?
So it means the pathway,
The pathway.
and it's a
Wow.
French last name. I'm actually originally from Maine, along the Canadian border. All the way at the top is where my kind of extended family is
Yeah,
originally from.
the way.
Beautiful.
You sound like a
Nate
Star
Lavoie.
Wars character, Mandalorian, the way.
It
So,
does sort of have, and then I think in more recent terms, it got translated into the platform, like a train platform.
Really?
La voie is
Lavoie,
like it.
the platform.
So yes.
Cool. You could be
beautiful.
a brand for a new company. I mean,
Well,
Yeah.
welcome to our episode, Nate. And we're so excited to have you today and hear from your amazing career trajectory and journey. But Nate, why don't you introduce yourself? Right now, you're at Sanofi. You're the head of the change management there, but you have an amazing background. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what got you here?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for both having me on the podcast. So, as you mentioned, I am the global head of organizational change management and readiness at Sanofi. And then additionally, I bring to this conversation a rich experience that goes beyond my current work as well. I previously was the enterprise head of organizational design and performance management at CVS Health. And then before that, I spent many years in the management consulting space working at Accenture for many years in the talent and organization practice, and then additionally at Deloitte as well in their human capital practice. So that experience overall has really shaped a lot of my experience and what I bring to the table in terms of knowledge here today.
Very cool. Welcome. And where are you based out of, Nate?
I'm based out of Boston, and so I'm based out of Sanofi's office here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then I live across the river over on the Boston side. For anyone from Boston, I live in the Fenway neighborhood, not too far from the stadium.
Very cool.
Awesome.
Very cool. Awesome. So, Nate, you mentioned that you lead the change management for Sanofi, and
Yes.
you have done the lot of change manage org transformation. What does
Yes.
that even mean? There are so many definitions around that, and
hmm
what does that mean for you, and what does that make it different as you put it in practice? We would love to know more.
Absolutely. And I think it's really great to spend some time talking about this. I think when we often think about change management or you hear it talked about, especially in the consulting space, it's often coming from a perspective around technology implementation or process implementation. And so I think it's really important to take time to think that change management is also necessary when you're also going through organizational transformation, or shifting org structure, reporting lines, hierarchy, jobs and roles and responsibilities, or operating model. All of those together really do require change management as well. And it's important to think about the change differently. How you would go about, moving through change management for a technology or process implementation often involves different elements. You're typically targeting user groups of a particular technology or process, and then you're training as well on the new system or new process. When you're thinking through organizational transformation, it's really critical that you're bringing people on the journey. You're explaining the why. I kind of coined, and it's not myself, but it's out there. Um, the what, the why, and the how. And I think you really need to ground your employees and your targeted user groups through those three major components when you're going through organizational change. And I think it's really important because when you transform an organization, you can shift the operating model. But if you're not also bringing the people with you, all you've done, whether it's operating model or org design, is you've shifted, potentially boxes, you've put in place, new hierarchies, you've shifted, organizational lines of business. But have you shifted the way people understand their role in the organization or how they work? The ways of working are really critical to making an operating model work. And that's even more important in today's environment where we're really seeing AI, being implemented, and we're seeing a lot more, even more so AI plus humans being implemented. And it's not just AI automating and taking over jobs and roles. It's really where you see the value being created, where you have that human plus machine together, really working to enable the business in a new and differentiated way, with better, productivity and also increased acceleration of speed. Um, you really see those benefits. But again, coming back, if you're not working through with people, how they need to change and operate in a new way, you won't reap the value of, how you're changing the organization.
That's awesome. And I think particularly consultants, you get paid to do a design. Here's the design, and then you might have a business case, and part of the business case, you might have a communication plan or something, and then off you go into the sunset onto the next one. Um, and so the real work only really starts then. And so it'd be great for our listeners to hear some of the tools that you use. So if you talk about the why to start with, and the case for change, and why you're doing what you need to do, what are some of the sort of tools and ways you go about communicating that and getting people to understand it and internalize it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different ways. One of the key ways that I go about that is really having a solid change management story or narrative. That really is the grounding piece for organizational transformational change. And it really should, in that narrative, explain and ground people again in the why, and also walk through at a very high level the from to. What is changing? What will they experience? What are some of the high level impacts? Again, in this narrative, you don't want to get down to the nitty gritty at a role level, but you're talking at the organizational level. What is changing and then why. Connecting back into the business strategy is extremely important. I think more than ever it's really important that employees and resources understand how they translate into the strategy, how the strategy then impacts them and how it all plays together. And I think not everywhere you see that connection and that follow through. Coming back to some of my experience that I've also done previously, it's really important to thread that strategic lens through both your communications, but grounding it in the narrative as well.
And what kind of assets do you use for that? And what kind of
Yeah.
media?
Yeah, so I think really from the most part, we really see, number one, creating a compelling presentation that you typically are then going to reuse. So especially if you're a global company, you're going to have to be going to European Works Council typically for any organizational change. That European Works Council deck should be your starting place. That really then, of course, is the material that you can publicly release after the Works Council presentation and really gets you started before you go to more local Works Councils at the country level. But that EWC deck should really ultimately, because you have to explain to the EWC why, what, and how you're changing as well. And thinking through that both from an regulatory standpoint can then help you translate that into what does it mean for employees as well. So typically that presentation is done, a little bit traditional. It's typically a PowerPoint presentation that you present to the European Works Council. And then you would then reuse and be able to leverage those slides internally at town halls, at overviews, at a strategic all hands where you're walking people through at a high level, announcing and kind of bringing them awareness that the transformation is starting. So you might also then pair that with additional communication assets, short video clips. You might also post an intranet internally. If you have the budget, those videos could be either more robust and could be in person, live, in a recording studio, or you also could just use something simple like Powtoons to create more of a cartoon clip that can be 30 seconds and help bring visual interest and sort of hook people into the transformation.
So what I hear you actually, Nate, is that it's it's not just about the communication, but it's the consistency in that communication across the organization. So from top to bottom, everybody's talking about the same language and understanding the why in the same way, rather than it is restricted to the same, like to a very specific strata of the organization. And
I would
that is, yeah. Go ahead,
I would
please.
absolutely agree that that cascade, as you're describing, is critically important, especially around organizational change for, operating model and org structure change. And it's key that you're grounding and walking through that cascade with each group. You're really informing your senior leaders, you're giving them that presentation, you're arming them with key messaging and talking points, you're arming them also with a really robust FAQ. And again, some of these tools sound quite simple, But it's really important to just stick to the basics. You want clear messaging, clear communication, and you want, as you mentioned, that cascade to go through all levels of the organization that is under transformation. So when employees have questions, they can get answers. When, middle managers have questions, they can get answers. So you're really addressing all levels and, again, leading them on the journey to meet them where they're at. Of course, at the beginning, they're really going to be going through just the awareness phase. But as they move through the change journey and then come back to the beginning again, you see them evolve in their understanding and the conversations that are happening between managers or senior leaders and employees are changing. You'll see them at the beginning trying to understand more of the why. And then, as you progress through the change journey, you're starting to get more questions, and you also need to talk more about the what. What is changing? How will this impact your job? How will this impact your work? And then what do you need to do differently? How do you need to perform differently? How do you need to work differently together? How do you collaborate?
And the interesting thing about communication is you can't over communicate. And I think the biggest mistake, so you talk about simplicity, because you have to repeat and repeat and repeat. I think someone said somewhere that, you have to say something 7 times before someone has a chance of actually hearing it and understanding it and remembering it. And so just the great leaders to say the same thing over and over and over again. And it has to be simple because otherwise you won't remember. And, as smart as we all are, we're not that bright. And we just need to be
Yes.
told the same thing over and over. Uh, and hearing it from multiple different channels and multiple different people, hearing it from your line manager, you BU lead, the CEO, the whole way. So that's what's coming through loud and clear. And what I'm hearing from you as well is then as you go through that journey, with time, the detail starts revealing itself. So getting to the role impact. Is that a fair kind of inference?
Absolutely. And then once you really reach that sort of rubber meets the road phase of change, of where you really need to get into the detail, that's where you really need even more reinforcement because people need to fully understand, especially if you're going through an operating model change, for example. Typically you might have new jobs and roles designed and outlined. You might have new roles and responsibilities. There might be new ways of working that are needed because you've changed, the organizational structure. So how people need to cross collaborate and work, across lines, across silos. Or if you're implementing, something um, completely new, such as more agile, moving more towards squads or, setups that are, really different from previously before, it's even more important to really get those pieces right and spend time, really working through that, and that requires role playing or, workshops, even simple exercises like stop, start, continue, or having people, I've in some ways repurposed, an Amazon tactic where they're famous for not having PowerPoint slides in some of their senior leadership meetings. And so they read through a memo or a brief and then they discuss it. I've sort of applied the same thing as well in some organizational change where you read through roles and responsibilities, for example, or new ways of working. And then as a group, you sit around the table and discuss it. And it's very similar to even role playing through a use case or scenario. At the end of the day, people talking to each other is what creates that alignment and understanding on how to work. If you're simply just sending out an overview of a new org structure, an overview of new ways of working, like words or even a video, it's not often enough because people ultimately are still in today's work environment working together and collaborating. and needing to do so in new and different ways as technology comes into the picture.
Yeah. And this reminds me, Rupert, in your book, this is amazing, by the way, Nate, because sometimes we over energize ourselves in putting that design in place that Rupert first talked about, and the consultant gets hefty payments based on that. And
Hmm.
then we are like, never cross checking it. We're never discussing it. We magically somehow think that it will all work when it all starts in reality, but it is far from that. And so being able to just come in a room, come on the same page, and then discuss that how is it all going to work in practice is such a powerful tool in itself. And Rupert, in
Mm.
your book, it's how whip is what
Yeah,
you actually describe it. So I just wanted to make that connection that
thank you,
great
Shradha.
mind thinks alike.
Yeah,
So, and to the listeners who are listening, you can go and check out for how whip as well, because it's very much similar to what Nate is talking about. Um,
and also leveraging that role play.
yes,
So the
exactly.
walkthroughs. The other exercise we do, Nathan, in the how that I've talked about is just it's the interface design. So where things
Hmm.
go bad is the handoffs and what do I need from you? I call it the give get. So what do I expect to get from you and what do I need to give to you? And it's
Hmm.
having speed dating sessions and you have someone facilitating and listening, getting all the issues into I call it the how it log, which is the like an issues log. How's it going to work in practice log? And just but again, it's that conversation. How I need this, when, how, and you're clarifying in your own mind what outputs you need to give for the different your different stakeholders and it, everything's sort of intertwined. Um, and I love your idea of being inspired by AWS and just having people read it in the room because I mean I think Jeff Bezos recognized and we all recognize even if you give people pre-reading they said they've read it they probably haven't so
Hmm.
and limiting that to I think he has 6 pages so that's a really nice innovation in this
Yeah,
space as well.
yeah. And the question I have for you, Nate, is that as you are thinking about, like, as you design this part, like, the role plays and getting
Hmm.
people together, they're big personalities that you're bringing together in a room who are having their own hidden agendas and so many goals that are conflicting. What are some of the skill sets that you and your team need to have in order to be able to facilitate this conversation? Like, how do we how do we equip as a change managers to facilitate these kind of really high charge, high stakes conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think number one, just, having a background in understanding, organizational dynamics. And, I think that's rooted ultimately in just communication skills. You are, both from a written standpoint, but also interpersonal communication skills. And I think this is a great point to just add a piece around, especially this role playing from my perspective and what I've seen in my experiences. Actually, rather than having, a member of the change team facilitate that, I try as much as possible to push the business leaders to lead those conversations. And, I, have a list of like common challenges to successful change management. My number one thing is leaders not championing change. You know, the business needs to own change management. I think it's the same thing from my perspective when I've also done org design in my career and would be welcome to any additional thoughts. But I think that's where you always see a breakdown in design is when you don't actually have the leaders involved and it's like design being done onto them. And you need that collaboration. It's the same in the change space. Leaders need to be not just a figurehead for change, they need to be involved. They need to be meeting with their team. And I think that's where I also see those role playing exercises or reading around the table, and then talking and discussing. I really see that working best at the team level where you sort of mostly have people of the same, sort of level working together. And of course, that can also happen at the senior leadership level as well. Um, as they, have to change and transform too. But I think it's really important in ensuring that you have leadership buy-in and involvement through the journey, end to end.
Love that. And I think it also then becomes a a space for team building for these leaders as well, right? It just facilitates better relationship between them. They
Hmm.
are able to understand each other's challenges, each other's problems, and then they create a sense of empathy for each other. That, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, I never thought that you are struggling so much, or nobody's hearing have heard me before, but now I'm able to present myself. So I think it is so many ways that these things are helpful.
And that brings me to a quick point. I know it's not exactly on our topic, but I think it's really important message to leave is that this is why we're also seeing such a need, especially as technology automates, a lot of like work activities, but then there's a need for more strategic value add work. That work is often relationship driven. It's often in person. It's often, or it can be done virtually as well, but it's where we're seeing the need for skills changing. For so long, and of course, technical skills are still absolutely required, but especially within leaders and managers, we are needing power skills or, previously referred to soft skills. And, that's where you really need people coming to the table. And when you are hiring and selecting leaders, ensuring that they not only just have the technical skills to do the job or lead the team, but they also have these power skills in order to also lead in the most effective way in today's environment.
Can you break down power skills? What are examples
Yeah,
of power skills?
influencing, communication, understanding of change management, empathy, psychological safety, being able to have difficult conversations, being able to also engage, have executive presence, all of these, and there's definitely many, many more that go back there as well. But this is where we're really seeing a need. And it's also where I think a lot of companies are seeing gaps at the moment because for a long time, people were, put into leadership roles based off of either demonstrated, technical performance or, hitting sales numbers. But do they have the power skills for that position as well? And in today's world where automation is coming, or we're seeing digital and humans, and we're seeing more and more, these skills are becoming even more necessary more than ever. We're needing, especially in the environment, connecting back to change management is no longer a point in time. We're not seeing organizations transform and then that org design is done for, 5 or 10 years. We're seeing organizations continuously need to adapt to new ways of working, to new structures, to create efficiency. That technology is also changing so fast, they're having to adapt for that as well. And so, thus, we're seeing these power skills needed in leadership roles more than ever before in order to lead these teams effectively. Because, you know, for so long, you might only need to meet with your employees or do a town hall, like, less rarely. And now we're seeing a need for increased communication.
And there's with this, there's the why, and there's the overarching business case from a business perspective. But we're talking about human beings here, and there's going to be winners and losers, and there's people that talk about accountabilities. Well, certain people lose accountability and responsibility for certain things that they might have held really dear to them, and that goes to ego and other things. So,
Hmm.
in this process, could you maybe talk to dealing with that side of the change, which is the fear, the uncertainty, the doubt, even beyond obviously the obvious restructuring and possible, headcount losses. We put that to a side and say the people that are there, just dealing with all of that, and maybe for our listeners, some advice on how to deal with that and practical tools and mechanisms they can learn from.
Yeah, I think, there's really, and you're absolutely correct. It's definitely one of the, key reasons for change resistance is just fear of the unknown. And so I think it's really important to, in your messaging, state you're being as transparent as possible. You're going to bring as much information as you can when you have it to employees and ground them in the fact that you're not hiding things. Of course, as you're going through.
They might not believe you because they've heard that before, and there'll be a lot of cynicism out there.
Yes, that is fair. And I'm not sure you're gonna ever completely remove that. Realistically speaking, but I think by creating, environments for those discussions, those hard discussions, arming managers or leaders, again, coming back to the basics of having that clear deck, the key messaging, a really robust FAQ, walking them through that. Also, walking managers and preparing them for difficult conversations. I've led, before we've done organizational transformations or switched org structures, we've led managers through, a 1 hour sort of upskilling on, just the basics of change management, how to have a difficult conversation, tips and tricks and things of that nature. And then in the toolkit you provide them, you're not only providing separately that works council deck I've mentioned, or the FAQs and key messages, you're also providing them a change management toolkit that should be tailored to the org transformation at hand. You're giving them, again, these tips and tricks. You're giving them a little change management plan to reach up to the implementation of the new structure, kind of backing out like typical change management, maybe back out 90 days. Typically with org transformations, you're not able to necessarily back out as far as you might for a technology implementation, which you might start change activities all the way up, 6 months in advance. So here, you're really having to create those conversations, and that's also part of that cascade, forcing team discussions at the team level, providing the tools. There's also some elements that you can put into place, having either espresso chats or coffee chats where you kind of create a world cafe, but it's more speed dating, if you will, where you sort of have employees matched with a leader and they can talk one-on-one, or you could have 4 or 5 and you're kind of rotating around through. There's also another activity called the fishbowl exercise that I've done before, and that's where you sort of have a group of leaders in the middle that are there to answer questions, and you have a larger crowd around the outside. In that middle center, you then invite people from the crowd to come up and ask questions. And then they're addressing it in the room live, again, in person, but you could facilitate this. There are some ways to do it virtually, but
Nate,
I've seen it really.
this fishbowl, I've seen it on
Mhm.
YouTube, but I've not seen it in practice. You'd have to be quite a brave leader to go in the middle there. Maybe just talk through some examples where you've done it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I've actually put it into place twice with large groups, specifically also helping to advance an organizational transformation at hand. Once was as part of a leadership summit. And that was with a group of 250. And then in the middle of of course, this was done at a conference event space. So, there were people to arrange the chairs. It really should be done in a circular like fashion, or sort of a half circle moon as well can work. Um, and so in the middle, I think we had 4 to 5 leaders for that time. And it was a really productive, great conversation. And it actually went so well, we put it into place in, for another transformation as well. And that was a larger group of people, more towards like 350, at a summit like event as well, again at a conference space. And that we had a few more leaders in the middle. And actually, the conversation was not necessarily as it was still really productive. However, I think with more people in the middle, like you just have more answers and the conversation takes longer. So you're actually getting to less questions. So by having less people in the middle answering questions allows you to then kind of get through a bit more content and discussion. So that would be my only piece of advice around it. But again, ensuring leaders are comfortable with the exercise. A day before, we also did practice with those leaders to ensure that they were comfortable. That was on the kind of dry run day for the
Probably
entire
help the
summit.
leaders think through some of the answers they should have thought through as well. Like it's
Yeah,
going to make you really dial in. And to your
Yeah.
point
exactly.
earlier about the leaders needing to own it and drive it, if you're sitting there in the middle, there's three or four of you with 250, people. You've got to be on top of your game. I mean, and that preparation. My suspicion is the prep exercise is probably more valuable than the actual exercise.
Yeah, I'll also state that, these events were also really aimed at a leadership level. So everybody was at the same level in the while there. So, of course, there are some discrete levels, that are higher, of course, but for the most part, it's a level playing field. So you're not really having like really low level employees coming up to ask questions to very senior leaders. So again, it's about thinking through the logistics of the event and making sure you have either the right level of people. And if you do have that sort of big sort of space between levels, then you probably want to ensure the people in the middle are, again, aimed and prepared. Or additionally, and we did this before as well, in another example where you prepare, the people coming as well with the questions ahead of time. Like always it's not always 100% up for chance. So you can facilitate the exercise where you do have some planted questions, but then you also open it up and see what else is out there. But typically your first question or your first two might be planted, so you can kind of control the direction because typically your subsequent questions are going to follow the path of where you kind of start.
One thing it also helps me think through is that what you're mentioning, Nate, is the preparation while the change is happening. But there is a step before that as well, that how the organization is preparing itself collectively. And a big part of that is also trust, right? Like, a big part of organizational leaders trusting each other and employees trusting organization that this is done for the good and not just for, like, having a target on our backs. And that psychological safety and trust, how does the organization build that, is also extremely important part of the change management that you're saying. So that is what came into
Yeah.
my mind.
One other tool, because I think tools are always helpful for our listeners, is the whiffum and the whammy. And the whammy is far more powerful than the whiffum. So the whiffum is what's in it for me, which is the upside. Why is this good? Why is this change going to be
Hmm.
great? And thinking it from the individual perspective. So, communication is also about understanding the audience. And from the audience, what they're listening to is, okay, what's in it for me? And what they're going to listen to way more, it's why is this against my interest? How is this going to hurt
Love
me?
that.
And
Yeah.
that's the elephant in the room, and that's going to be unsaid. And a lot of people, that's to the psychological safety point that you're talking about, Nate. If you can build that psychological safety, they will get that out on the table and they will express it in that environment. But often there's not the trust there, as Shradha talks to, because of history, and so finding ways to think through, particularly the whammies, why it's against my interest, and get that out on the table and have those conversations, which is, you talked about difficult conversations, Nate. Those are the difficult conversations,
Hmm.
you know,
Absolutely.
and they have to be had. And, and the way I was trained to do this, and be interested in your perspective, is if you've got a bad message, you have to get it out quickly, clearly, and at the beginning of the meeting. Like, people know. So yeah, maybe we're almost out of time, but maybe just some reflections on that, Nate, and then we probably need to wind up. Unfortunately, time just flies.
Yes, I do agree. It is important to be transparent about the messaging. I think you enter into there are some tricky situations as well, especially in larger global organizations, where you can't always talk about, you know, all of the negative impacts right off the bat. As I mentioned, you often go to the European Works Council first prior to local works councils at the country level. You can't talk typically about your, you know, a riff, if you will, like before those local works councils happen at the country level. So you're often having to be as transparent as you can when you can in the journey. And when the time is right in the journey from a regulatory standpoint, it is important to, be clear, about, the impacts and, how, what will happen, how people will be impacted, and then coming back to the when as well. And so I think there's, sort of different stages that you can put into place from a comms perspective where you're informing people, you're engaging them, and then you're really explaining to them. And that can kind of walk you through in a way that you can be aligned to some of the regulatory processes that you need to go through as a global organization while also still being as transparent as possible. And then again, I think it's really important that those tough conversations happen at the team level, because I think when they're happening in like a really big global all hands, you they're not able to have that intimate conversation that really happens more at the team level, where they have the psychological safety to have those difficult conversations. So looping back to the need for the cascade and ensuring that all levels of the organization are aware and can explain the transformation, talk about it, and have a discussion comes back to the piece where you really do need to arm those middle managers so they can have those team discussions at the team level in smaller group setting where people will feel more comfortable to ask those delicate questions. And then, of course, when the time is right, you've of course armed those managers with, talking points, and in their toolkit, they're ready to have those discussions and provide that information about impact. Hey, we know that, there will be a people impact here. There will be some employees who are, leaving from the team. And, this is why, we're transitioning the strategy, we're refocusing the business, we're, pivoting to include automation. I think the clearer you can be on the why, again, coming back, provides that transparency to people, around just why is it happening. If you don't say something, then it allows room for rumors and other thoughts to creep in.
Absolutely. Well, Nate, as Rupert said, we always are out of time and we can go on and on forever. But we spoke a lot about the tools that you're using. Is there any favorite tool as we wrap up the session that you would like to share?
Yeah, I think um it's not necessarily a tool that I own as the change management lead. It's typically tapping into employee listening data. So I partner with our employee listening team to review some of the data collected from our employee listening surveys, whether that be monthly pulse checks that are done, or, your large annual like employee listening survey, and understanding the temperature and where people are at, and then leveraging that to then kind of craft, and influence your strategy and change management approach. So the tool I really would say is use data, to then arm your change management strategy and approach. And you're not just blindly going into it, saying, okay, these are the steps we need to follow. This is what we need to do. Really meeting people where they're at with what they need as much as you can. Of course, you're going to get, feedback from employees that you can't always address, or you can't always, put something in place to prevent, but you can listen to people as much as possible.
Yeah, use
And
data to strengthen your why. Basically, that's what
yes.
you're saying. Yes.
And then in terms of a trap, I think really it's that piece, coming back. I think you really need to, coming back to what Rupert said around the whiffum and the whammy. I think, really ensuring that, again, you're being, really clear about, the what, the why and the what and the how, and also you're providing some clarity around the impact. I think if you're not thinking from a employee human-centered lens, picking up material or reviewing a video or reviewing a deck, thinking through, okay, how would I read this as the employee? What does the employee need to know? Like, how are they going to react? And also pressure testing. Have some safe spaces or different levels in the org. Go to your, HR business partners, go to key leaders, ask them to review, ask their perspective, and see what they think before you're, just deploying material into the organization.
No,
That's
that's brilliant.
fantastic.
Thank you so much, as always. And Shradha, keep safe.
Thank you, Rupert.
Look after your guests and the other
I
random
surely
people that
will.
show up. And until next time, thanks everyone. Thanks
Until
again, Nate.
next time. Thank you.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.